Hello everyone, this is your Professor Adam Dunstan. The topic for today is titled Parks and People and Profit. So the first line there, Parks and People, is reference to an ongoing conversation, especially from 2000 to 2010, as it was really lively, but I would say still ongoing in anthropology and other social science fields about the effects of protected areas on local people. We tend to think of protected land as a good thing, at least in certain contexts, from a point of view, if we're thinking from the point of view of preserving wildlife. But also at the same time, if you think about what a protected area is, among other things, it is quite literally an area with protections, or we might say regulations or limitations on what people can do. So what is the impact on local people? I also put and profit here because I have lumped together with the kind of parks and people debate conversation also talking about some topics that go together with it really closely, in particular sustainable development and the concept of neoliberal conservation. So that's where we're going today. First, I want to tell a bit of a story, and it is a story where we'll be returning to Indonesia, where we were a couple weeks ago, and we briefly talked about. And I want to talk about extractivism. So extractivism or extractionism, the idea of rapid extraction of a natural resource for the purpose of the economic development, particularly of nations in need of growing their economy. And so, for example, in Indonesia, this is a chart of GDP for Indonesia over time. The Big Dip, if you're curious, was an economic crisis that profoundly affected Southeast Asian nations. But in any case, here's the overall GDP growth of Indonesia over time. And as you can see, it's undergone tremendous economic growth over the past 20 years. At the same time, that same time period, as well as decades previous, has seen significant losses of forest cover in Indonesia. This is the annual forest cover loss, so it's how much is being cut a year, essentially. And as you can see, this is, well, cut and not properly replaced. So yeah, this is the overall trend, and actually I would guess, it's unfortunate that this chart ends at 2015, because I would guess that the numbers would, despite that little decline there, would be much higher now, because the last 5 years, 7 years, has seen a really big, really rapid increase of palm oil production in Indonesia. Very, very heavy increase in palm oil production. So yes, the economy of Indonesia has been growing really fast, and at the same time, a lot of the forest of Indonesia has been being lost, with effects on a variety of species, including large mammals found within that forest. There's also impacts upon indigenous people that depend on the forest. So there are approximately 70 million indigenous people in Indonesia. That's about a quarter of the population. And there was a report recently, it was by Human Rights Watch, so it's an NGO. They have their own particular point of view, and so I'm not going to say that this is the only point of view, or even that this is 100% the right way to view this data, but I'm mainly going to be drawing on their quotes more than anything that they did with about 100 different community members. The report is titled, "When we lost the forest, we lost everything. Oil palm plantations and rights violations in Indonesia." So as you may or may not be aware, palm oil is one of those things that's sort of in everything. Well, not everything. It's in a lot of things, though. It's in everything from toothpaste to Oreos, right? As a solidifying agent. And it's made out of certain kinds of palm trees, which are grown in these things called palm plantations for the palm oil. And in Indonesia, part of what has happened is that there are large chunks of the various tropical forests that indigenous people, such as different Dayak groups, have customarily used. We would call them customary use lands, but they may or may not have formal legal title to. A similar situation as what we often see in the Amazon with indigenous peoples and deforestation. A lot of times you have indigenous people who have been there for decades, probably centuries, and customarily have been left to themselves by the government, but their land, or rather the trees on their land, have suddenly become a very valuable resource, or in this case, the land, once you convert the land over into a different kind of forest, right? Get rid of the forest that was there and turn it into a palm oil plantation, is very valuable. And so indigenous people's customary rights then get displaced by private companies coming in, sometimes signing agreements with local people that the local people may or may not fully understand, or that the company may or may not live up to. So for example, in this report, they talk about companies promising, oh yeah, we'll get you a new house in another area, and it's going to be in this great community that's going to have a lot of great services, and you're still going to be able to hunt and fish and stuff, and da 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 da. And then people describe, yeah, we got relocated to a new home, but then we got just surrounded by the palm oil plantation, and it definitely doesn't have all these services, nor are we allowed to go hunt and fish and gather like they said. In fact, they chase us off their lands, which were our lands. So agreements signed that companies are essentially extorting local landowners, not living up to the conditions under which people signed away customary rights, or just people losing the customary rights, period, because a lot of what happens here, there is a procedure in Indonesia for customary rights to be formalized as legal property rights under the Indonesian government, but it's a very complicated and long process, and therefore a lot of people don't go through it. So for people that didn't go through it, again, either an agreement is signed or perhaps an agreement isn't signed. In either way, they're displaced from their land. So it shows you really the power of certain kinds of land regimes, right, and certain kinds of legalities, and the way they displace sort of indigenous land tenure. As a result of this, we have between roughly 500 to 1,000 land conflicts a year that get reported to the Indonesian government or other sources, meaning people being displaced from their land or otherwise having conflict over their land rights. They feel like their land rights have not been respected by these huge palm oil companies coming in, right, with a lot of foreign capital and a lot of foreign power, that the government obviously wants the economy to grow, right, wants big companies to move in, generally speaking, but then it's indigenous people that are really receiving the brunt of it. For example, Dayak groups who traditionally were and are still many times groups of people, the specific Dayak groups here in these areas, who are involved in a lot of fishing and a lot of hunting, and also a lot of small-scale rice cultivation. So it's kind of, if you want to use classic anthropology terms, a mix of foraging and horticulture. Good example of what we talked about earlier in the semester, that oftentimes people use more than one subsistence strategy. I'm going to share a number of quotes. Oh, one other thing culturally about Dayak peoples in that area. Many people have Christianized at this point, although to some degree, to various degrees, customs from before Christianity have persisted. There's traditionally the sacred traditions, the religion, were very much bound up with the forest. You went and did ceremonies in the forest or involving products from the forest. You buried your dead by erecting these large kind of tower things, and actually not burying them, but rather putting them on there so they can't just be sort of accosted by animals or something, and allowed to decompose up there. Not possible anymore. Nowadays, a lot of times people are resorting to just putting the body in a forest. There's birth rituals that have to do with the forest, and so traditionally the spirituality was closely tied in with the forest, and some of that has carried over post-Christianity, as we see often being the case when indigenous groups adopt Christianity. Oftentimes pre-Christian conceptualizations of sacred nature end up sometimes persisting more than you would think, definitely. So I'll read a few quotes from the report, though. Lyndon, 58-year-old mom, says, "The forest used to supply all our needs. Now if the rains come, everything floods," right? The forest does not have sort of the traditional deeply rooted trees. So you're going to get more erosion, you're going to get more flooding. The forest is gone. There's no way to hold back water. We can't plant anything. We lost everything to palm oil. Mormonis, a village leader in Jaya, forest means everything. Forest provides water. Water is blood. Land is body. Wood is breath. When we lost the forest, we lost everything. We can't pray to the god of oil palm, right? So this displacement of indigenous religious practice. I also liked the quote, wood is breath. A concept we'll come back to a few times in this lecture is ecosystem services. Ecosystem services is the idea that there are things which the environment provides for us that are an economic service that like help our survival and our economy, that would be much more expensive to do artificially, that the environment just sort of does for us if we keep natural processes still operating. So a good example, as wood is breath points out, is oxygen circulation and creation of a certain amount of oxygen through the photosynthetic process. Another couple of quotes. Francesca. Sometimes you see dead fish afloat on Sungai River, Semunying. It means something killed them. So this is something that the report says, we weren't able to confirm this, but local people who have obviously observed the water for a long time allege that the water has gotten a lot dirtier and that it is directly attributable to the pesticides and different things used in the plantations. So she says, it means something killed them. Poison from the number of hectares of land covered by oil palm. If you don't already know this, in a lot of parts of the world, instead of using acres like most Americans, people use hectares. You'll see that a lot in environmental publications. Poison from the number of hectares of land covered by oil palm. When it rains, a lot of fish end up dead. We can't eat that. So they talked about in that report as well, indigenous people having to boat, a mile or multiple miles away to go fishing instead of where you traditionally would, right by your village, because the fish are contaminated, right? Or people understand them to be contaminated. And they point out that this is a particular burden on women who may not have a boat or economic capital to have a boat under the sort of social arrangements there. So not able to provide fish for themselves if they want to. All right, another quote. I was surprised, this is not from Francesca, this is from somebody else. I was surprised to see big equipment near the river. I asked what the equipment was for, and the operators told me it was to make the state road to Samarahan, Sarawak, in Malaysia. I visited their base camp in 2005, a month after I was made village leader. I was told the company was called Pitiledo Lestari. So, and then another. Before our lives were simple, not rich, but enough, right? Acknowledging that it's not as if it was like natural, just affluence, everything was comfortable or something. People aren't sort of romanticizing it, but they say, but it was enough. Since oil palm came, there's more suffering. I can't feed my family. So a lot of people find themselves in a situation where they don't have employment. They're in remote areas or areas with not a strong economy, so they can't find very good wage labor work. But their traditional way of hunting, fishing, rice cultivation doesn't work anymore once the land rights have been displaced. He says, I can't feed my family. I have a baby. I must put food on the table every day. How do I do that when both of us are not working? Every day I must figure out how to do this. And then here, Mario, an older woman, said that before oil palm, I was happy. I had a house, garden, and planted rice. She used to live in a traditional hut made of wood and sadang leaves, but now lives in a plastic tent. When we had the forest, we could use plants as medicines. Now, with no forests, we can't get medicinal plants, and we buy medicines, right? So that's an additional economic cost there. After palm, I'm constantly running away from people who want to catch me when I collect fruits, right? You go into the forest to collect some fruits. Those land rights are now considered the company's land rights. You are no longer allowed to gather fruit there. So as you can see, a lot of burdens on people's basic abilities of food sovereignty, right? Their ability to provide food for themselves. For a group of people doing a lot of foraging. You say several Orang Rimba, that's another ethnic group, talk about their traditional birthing rituals that were lost. Before, when a baby was born, we chose a tree for the baby. The tree grows and the baby grows. The tree represents that baby. right? Anthropologists, folklorists, if they were being particularly nerdy, would call this imitative magic, but we might better just call this sacred ritual, right? Causing sort of a syncope between baby and tree. With no forest, we don't do those rituals anymore. Orang Rimba also talks about, again, the built platform. So it was actually Orang Rimba groups that I was talking about before. They would leave the dead there for their souls to find their path. But now they can't, so they actually just go into the national park, but you obviously can't build like a big pit or a big tower thing, a platform on the national park, so they just dump it there and come back. We could multiply, so the Indonesia example of palm oil plantations and their effects on indigenous people is profound, right? It's a profoundly sad story. There have been efforts to do better. There's various sort of sustainable palm oil certifications and things like that. Some of that is tied in with the Indonesian government, and there's concern that it's not defined very well what sustainable means, or it's not very transparent. It's certainly a discussion we're going to need to have. On the one hand, we can all make choices to use less palm oil, but at least for the time being, we use a lot of palm oil in our economy, as do many economies around the world. So we have to have, I think, really serious discussions about either moving to an alternative or a really rigorous sort of way of ensuring sustainability and indigenous rights, which is part of what this report is recommending, is a more clear structure for indigenous land rights. Oak Teddy Mine, another example of sort of a theoretically empowering economic development in a country going awry. So you have the Oak Teddy Mine is a major open pit mine in Papua New Guinea. It used to be run by BHP Billiton, which is an Australian group or a New Zealand group, a very large mining group. They eventually got out of that business, though, and it out of this specific mine, partly I think because of the controversies involved, and it was eventually taken over actually by the Papua New Guinean government. So very kind of interesting resource politics there. It's not sort of just the country and the bad guy outside company, but the country actually took over the mine and continued to use it for mining. But the mine, over about a 25-year period, produced, because I'm counting 1990 to 2015, produced about 2 billion tons of untreated waste. The original plan of what to do with the waste, I think it was like a storage pond, which is a pretty common kind of measure, ended up breaking, overflowing. So you just get a bunch of untreated waste going in there. Has all sorts of bad effects, one of which is just a lot of sediment. A lot of sediment like this is going to cause various problems downstream, as well as tailings, some degree toxicity, different things. And so you have, plants dying off, sago palms dying off, flooding events, a variety of not great things. This is Alex Mann, by the way, who sued BHP Billiton over this. So it's been a major disaster, and one that's resulted in a lot of litigation between New Guinea and the mine, as well as private landowners. And so with both Oak Teddy and with the palm oil issues in Indonesia, obviously not the same, but both examples of an industry coming into an area, both interestingly in pretty close proximity in Southeast Asia, on the verge of Oceania. In both cases, though, we have essentially foreign industry coming in, or large industry from other parts of the country coming in, finding a very useful resource, attempting to extract it quickly, it seeming to offer a lot of economic promise for the country, and then having a profound effect on the local environment and local people, which is not to downplay also that some local people gain employment from these operations, but often there's a large number of local people who don't, but still suffer really negative environmental impacts. And so all of this reminds us that people need money, right? In a contemporary economy, the vast majority of the world's people need money, currency of some sort. There are very few exceptions now of societies that have are still non-currency. The vast majority of the world's people, they need money, and they have, I think, very reasonable expectations for a solid quality of life and for a prosperous country. And at the same time, the wrong kind of economic project, or even a good economic project gone wrong, depending on one's perspective and how you choose to phrase it, can cause untold amounts of suffering and challenges for local people. It all brings up the complexity and importance of managing our oikos. By oikos, I don't mean Greek yogurt, although it's delicious. Yum, 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 yum. By oikos, I mean the Greek word, which means our home. And as I think I've mentioned before, oikos is both the root word for ecology, the study of ecosystems, of living beings and their interactions with the non-living world. So ecology, but oikos is also, in an indirect way, the root word for economy and economics, right? It originally started out as the idea of sort of a household economy. And so before it grew to encompass like national economies. So economics and ecology come from the same root words, which makes sense because they are both ultimately about how living beings make a living. And ultimately, all economies, however detached they may seem, do depend on environmental resources, whether that be the rare earth metals in a computer, or the pizza that it takes to fuel the people that are working on the computer, or directly through something like farming or hunting or fishing, or power generation. So we all depend on a joint home, as do animals, as do plants, right? We're all living in this place, and we got one of these planets, as far as we know. And so it is a challenge figuring out how to balance everybody's needs, but it is an important and critical one. So that's to what we are what we are pointing our attention towards this week, is how to balance our common needs across humans, across the various non-human animal species, across the various biota of this world.